Today we're going to be talking about designing for immigration policy reform, and I'll hand it over to Sabrina to start the introductions.
Hi everyone, I'm Sabrina Fonseca. I'm a principal design researcher at Coforma. I'll be talking about two projects today. One is the Immigration Policy Tracking Project, and the other one is the Department of Homeland Security IMIVET project. Both of these I participated as a researcher. I am a white cis Latino woman in my 40s. I am sitting in New York City right now. I have brown hair with bangs, and I'm sitting in my home office.
Hey everybody, I'm Angela Palm Hopkins. I am Coforma's Director of Marketing and Communications. Today I'm going to be talking about content design strategies in relation to the Together.gov project that we worked on with the Family Reunification Task Force. I also am a woman in my 40s, white woman with long brown hair, and I'm sitting in my home office in Vermont.
Hi everyone, my name is Cecilia. I'm a content designer at Coforma. I will be talking about the translation portion for the Family Reunification Project. I am a Latina woman in my 30s with long brown hair, and I am speaking to you from my office in Miami, home office in Miami.
Hi everyone, I'm Eva Floyd. I'm one of Coforma's Directors of Design Research. I am a woman in my 40s, and I have wavy brown hair, and I too am sitting in my home office at the moment. Today I'm going to just provide a bit of an opening to this talk and some connecting themes. So here we go. So, designing for immigration and policy reform, these stories that you're going to hear are human-centered, collaborative, and integrative approach to user research and design, content strategy, and translation. It's critical in crafting digital solutions that serve people across different languages and engage beyond borders and effectively implement immigration reform policies. So today, 3 of my colleagues who you've just met will share some of their creative strategies and experiences working with government and other stakeholders such as NGOs, nonprofits, and private sector partners to meet complex policy goals on short timelines that simultaneously satisfy legal requirements and policy requirements, meeting a diverse range of user needs, building trust with those communities being served, and prioritizing accessibility. So that's a lot to say. It's the subtitle for the talk is Keeping It Real with Government, Prioritizing Equity, and Building Trust Along the Way. So, let's admit it, working in immigration can be a frustrating experience, but driving equity is one factor that really leads us to this work. And what do we mean by prioritizing equity when the concept of immigration itself isn't fair? For our purposes today, I'm going to define equity as the work that is done to help everyone get the support that they need in complex situations. It's in the hope that removing some of these barriers and making pieces of it just a bit easier help to move us all closer to fairness. So as you listen to the following stories, I invite you to watch for themes of hope and transformation and the pieces that add up to a positive impact. I think you may also notice some undertones of how trauma-informed approach may begin to build safety and transparency, where it could be difficult for immigrants to trust our government or or have the transparency that they need to understand the process. How critical peer support and collaboration can be in these efforts, and of course, how empowerment and choice are something everyone looks for and needs. So, with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Sabrina.
Hey, this is Sabrina. Thank you, Eva. I'm going to start by talking about the Immigration Policy Tracking Project. This is the most comprehensive immigration policy database for tracking the Trump administration's actions that has ever been created. It was intended for immigration policy workers and media to find all of the immigration actions taken by Trump in the hopes to try and help these people undo them. This project was created by Lucas Gutentag, who's a policy, immigration policy specialist who has been featured in Politico, in the New Yorker, many other platforms. And this website has been honored by Fast Company as a notable world-changing idea. Our goal with this project was to overhaul the tool's look, feel, and functionality as policymakers prepare to change the policies that negatively impact the U.S. immigrants. So this website had been in place since around 2017 when these actions started, and it was 2020 when we started our work. Next slide. What was it tracking? It was tracking all different sorts of levels of actions in government, from legislation, rules, changes in practices, to things that are like a little bit smaller, like information and collection and forms, data reports, program terminations, all sorts of things, presidential orders, which are very big, agency directives and guidances, which can be very hard to track. And this is all, a lot of it is hard to track because some of the actions that are really small there is no way to like go and consult where those happen. So that was the intention of this website. And this was really the first attempt to try and log all of it to make sure nothing was lost, because you can't really undo something if you don't know what you're trying to undo. And this was a big lesson for the team because these actions exist in all levels of government, not just immigration. I didn't know about what exactly they meant, and I learned so much from this process. In immigration, this was especially interesting because immigration is the most complex law system in the United States after tax law. So it's already complex as it is, and you add this layer of complexity on top of it, and it becomes even more complex. And sadly, that's on purpose, that it's this complicated. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to show you what the previous website looked like when we got there. And you will see that there is, a set of categories on the left, which is a bit of a mix of types of immigration law areas and types of actions. There is these categories are show a timeline on the side on each one of these lines, where you see a dot for each one of the actions that has been taken. And if you're seeing this, you will know that it's like it looks overwhelming, because look at how many actions the Trump administration has taken to undo all of this. It's a lot. And my job on this project was to do interviews, do research with policymakers to try and figure out what is it that they needed from this website. Was this website doing its job, and to help these policymakers understand what was done, and would it help as a tool to try and come up with strategies to undo it? The first thing I learned from from these policymakers was that the timeline with these dots wasn't very helpful because it's overwhelming to me to look at the number of actions, but for policymakers who work on this all the time, they already know this. That's what they work on every day. They really didn't need to be reminded that there were so many actions that Trump administration took for this. And there were lots of specialized filters that were needed. So we worked closely in research with these policymakers to try and come up with a new taxonomy that would be more helpful to them. So on the next slide, I'm showing you what policymakers consider when creating these policy strategies. So there are things that are easy to convey, like number of people affected by an action, how easy it is to undo it, durability versus speed of undoing it, like how hard, how long will that last once it's undone, and level of harm. Some of these are like easy to convey, so you can convey them with stats or with like different types of filters, like types of action, what agencies were affected. You could have like subject matter commentary as well for some of them. And then others are like a little bit harder to convey, like tone setting and values and political ramification and trade-offs, and the level of interest in undoing this. Keep in mind that like a lot of these groups of policymakers we learned are from very different teams of how to undo policy. So some of them are like, here, let's undo all of these actions at DHS and it's going to be great. Whereas others are like, let's burn DHS to the ground and then create it from scratch and and start immigration all over again, which are conflicting strategies. And the people at the Immigration Policy Tracking Project didn't want to take a team on that discussion. They just wanted to give both teams, both sides, a way to discuss this issue and get deep into the more subjective piece and have them use that as a tool. Because really, next slide, what we've heard is everything needs to be addressed. Everything is important, as we heard from the mouth of one of our policymakers that we interviewed. So the first iteration of the website, which was launched in late 2020, was when the re-election hadn't happened yet. It was actually behind a login, and only policymakers who had the login could see it. There were concerns that this could be used as a tool on the opposite side. So that's why only known policymakers were given access to this. But here you can already see that there's like some improvement with the number of filters that we're giving them that allows people to search for actions based on subject matter, agency, policy status, type of action. There are numbers here so that you can see what's happening. The timeline's still there, but it's like a much smaller element. And there is a search where you can search for by keyword. On the next slide, you're going to see another iteration of this design, which is after the transition, after the election of Biden. This website opened up. You don't need a login to launch it anymore. And a few things that we changed is that we have basically a progress bar here that shows how many Trump actions still exist, how many are still partially in effect, and how many have been reverted. And on the next slide, I'm just going to show you a little bit of the filters. So there's like some really powerful filters here. You're seeing a list of the policies ordered by when they were announced, and you can filter by subject matter, by agency, by type of administrative action, and all sorts of other things. And it's a pretty powerful tool at this point that policymakers can use. So we think it's in a better place than where we found it, and we really hope that it's helping policymakers continue to do their job. The next project I'm going to talk about is DHS IMIVETS. So IMIVETS stands for Immigrant Veterans, and it's a task force at the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, that's focused on providing healthcare and a pathway back home to immigrant veterans who were deported after their sentences. So these people have all sorts of, they're eligible to all sorts of benefits, and they may not know about them. And this was basically a page that would give them access to some of these things. It was one page. When we started the project, we had 3 people on the project. There was the researcher, there was also a copywriter and a designer. And our goal was to turn this copy deck, which was basically a link bank, into a final design with refined content and a brand in just 4 days. This is because the launch for this page was coming up the following week, and it needed to go through clearance or something like that. I don't remember, but it was supposed to be launched very soon. We had very little time. There was just so much we could do, but we try to do our best here. So why is this project important? So on the next slide, there's a quote from one of the participants of our very quick research project that we did, which was basically with 3 people who were part of this, of the audience for this project. So what he said was that a lot of veterans aren't honorably discharged. They have a violent crime, which caused a deportation. What is not really being considered is that perhaps their combat service could be a root cause for what got them into that behavior. Worth a closer look to see if that behavior or crime of violence that rendered them deportable is a root cause. So basically, unfortunately, some of these people that were being deported had incurred into some behavior that could have been caused by what they went through during their military service. So on the next page, I'm showing you the design, the final design for the IMIVETS website. And, it's really just one page. It has a logo on the top and the title and some and an accordion that gives you access to a few different benefits that people can find. When we did testing with these 3 audience members, we heard a lot of good ideas about how this could go from a link bank to something way more powerful that could really help these people. And I hope that this is where it's going to go in the future. We definitely transmitted those ideas, but for now, most of the changes that we've made were really about language and making sure that things were understood. So a few things that I want to share with you here that made testing so important. On the next page, you're going to see that I'm just highlighting here the logo for the IMIVETS task force, which is this American flag, and IMIVETS is written in this serif font with a little star in the middle. If you can see it, it's kind of subdued. We tested the logos with people. We had a few options, and we wanted to make, and we only had 4 days. We wanted to make sure that it was right. So that was something that we tested. On the next slide, you're going to see a few options of what they looked like in the versions that we tested with people. One of the options had these chevrons pointing down, and one of our participants was really kind to point out that option looked like we were only accounting for the Navy branch of the military. No one in our team was in the military, had been in the military to really pick that up. So we were kind of using these elements freely. So it was really good to hear that that could have felt a bit exclusionary as an option. Next slide will show you, just highlighting here, the name of the page, services for current and former immigrant military members and their families. This was really hard to nail down because how do you describe this audience? So on the next slide, there's a quote from one of our participants who reacted to the name of the website that we had in the interim, which was, I don't remember what it was, but what he said was, look, you're either an active duty veteran, a prior active duty veteran, you're a family member of an active duty member, or you're a veteran outside of the United States, or you're an active civilian working outside of the US, or you're a foreign national working for the military. So not complicated at all. We just had to make sure that all of those people were accounted for and that we weren't excluding anyone. So it was really important to get that one right. So finally, on this website, on the next slide, I'm showing you a little call out, which was the main goal of this website, was this new resource, which was about helping these folks who had been deported find information to return to the U.S. if that's what they wish to do. So they had to go in and complete a request form, which is linked on this little call out. One thing that is in this call out is it says, get information about seeking return to the U.S. after deportation or removal. And before that, it only said removal. We think that it's because the whole DHS website uses that word. They don't seem to use deportation. I think it's because, legally speaking, maybe they want to soften the blow or something. I don't know. Maybe they think deportation is a strong word, but because it is, and also the thing is strong. But especially in this case, removal for someone who was in the military can mean removal from military service. So people were confused about this when they saw it. And we recommended that they added the word deportation there. We kind of had no hopes that they would end up doing it because of how strict their legal reviews were. But it was really nice to see that they did make that concession and they made it deportation or removal, and they agreed to just use use both words. So a few lessons learned here is just test. Many of our assumptions and the clients were dispelled by talking to actual people in this, the actual people that this work affected. And also we've learned that government's complicated. So understanding how the machinery of machinery of government works was really fascinating, but also really disheartening because some things just felt like so difficult, and like a lot of it just especially in immigration, so it just feels like it will never end. I don't know about other parts of the government, but this one is really feels like that. And then celebrating, the small victory. So, working in immigration in the U.S. can really feel like a thankless, endless job. And it will probably be like that until there's real immigration reform. But I think it's good. It's good to just learn to do what you can and learn to recognize the small achievements because they're not nothing, even if we feel like we can't do everything. So that's it for me. I'm gonna hand it over to Angela.
Thanks, Sabrina. Hey everyone, this is Angela speaking. So I'm going to deepen the conversation a little bit by talking about the experience of working on together.gov and some content strategies that helped us in that work. So this came about because thousands of families were separated at the U.S.-Mexico border under the zero-tolerance immigration policy from 2017 to 2021, with no plan for how they would be reunited. The Biden administration had sought to repair the humanitarian crisis that occurred as a consequence of that by creating the Family Reunification Task in 2021. The task force goal was to devise and facilitate a process through which qualified separated individuals could register to receive assistance and locate and reunite with those family members from whom they were separated previously. So in the summer of 2021, they decided to create a website that would be used to register people for that reunification process. which is where we came in. So CoForma worked closely with the government, with the task force, NGOs, CBOs, DHS, and users to develop a legally compliant MVP site using the US WDS that would make registration possible for people across 5 languages. Next slide, please. The government, so there were a lot of challenges right off the bat as soon as we kind of jumped into this. And the first one was the government wanted the application and site created and launched across those 5 languages in just 3 weeks. As you can imagine, building something from scratch in that timeline, let alone across multiple languages, is a pretty big ask. And we learned kind of shortly after we started that they wanted to provide all the content for that site, but they didn't have it ready or finalized, and the legal team was still working on it, so we weren't going to have access to that content quite yet. So we had to start anyway. We knew in a general sense what fields we would need for the form, but there was a lot of logic to work through to determine how to best design that form. And we needed content for 4 or 5 site pages that would help people understand whether or not they would qualify to register through this site. Another challenge that we had was that the government didn't want the site to look like a traditional US government site due to the broken trust that had resulted from the actions at the border under that zero tolerance policy, which was very understandable and a good direction for them to go. So we decided to start with that challenge to help drive the visual design and build the content's voice and tone to work out some of those initial logic problems while we waited for that content to be provided to us. Next slide. So as soon as we started the work, kind of knowing those initial challenges, we learned of some more challenges. We saw that not only would the legal language and content be delayed, but it would be frequently updated with numerous changes coming through, perhaps right up until the end of our launch date for the MVP. So that made managing content across multiple translations amid constantly changing legal guidance really, really tricky. We also learned that we'd have limited direct access to stakeholders, and we'd be faced with the political nuances that play when all involved parties came together. Everyone wanted the same thing, a site that people could use to register and reunite, but they each had different focuses around how that was going to happen and what was most important. Next slide. So since longer content for each of the site pages wasn't going to be made available to us quite yet, we placed our initial focus on building trust and steering away from that government vibe. And we did that through visual design, through the color palette that was selected, through the header copy that we wrote for the site, and the overall site design. So as you can see here, what you're looking at is just a sample of the visuals from the site. It's these kind of like different colored transparent silhouettes of people, and it's very asymmetrical. This really, we felt like, steered away from the traditional government vibe. Like it wasn't like a red, white, and blue thing, American Eagle vibe that can be kind of common in some of the other government brands. Next slide. So we wanted to reiterate trust and safety wherever we could find a place to do so on the site, which felt really important for this group of individuals whose trust had been broken and who had been through trauma. So in addition to the color palette and logo, one place that I was able to focus on trust and safety was in those headings and in the calls to action and in the snippets of copy that were going to precede some of this legal heavy content. Here you can see one on the screen here that says, committed to the safe reunification of families, which we tried to reiterate throughout the site. Next slide. So here you see another example of how we tried to do that. So we started creating content models that would work for the site pages and for the site rollout. And since we were waiting on approved content to plug into those models, we focused on some temporary content that prioritized the trust factor. That was not asked for. They did want to build trust, but they didn't specifically say, put this section in. But I thought it was something that was going to be important to people. And as we started talking to people, it definitely was important. So we wanted to create a section that told people up front that they would be safe from ICE referral and removal, and that none of the information that would be gathered by the site would be shared in that specific capacity. According to the executive order that established this task force, that was going to be true, but it wasn't really mentioned in any of the meetings or the content for the site as far as I had seen. So at first, the language we added was as friendly as possible, but it took some negotiating kind of back and forth and like getting it reviewed by legal to arrive at the final language, which did ultimately get adopted into the site, which I was very happy about, especially after learning from users that this was reassuring and gave them confidence in the process. Next slide. So we also learned from users who had gone through this reunification process, as some people that we had gotten access to have some testing done. We learned that people were going to typically use mobile to register, and there might be many people sharing a single phone. So in response, the content strategy used a design that prioritized those mobile users with a goal of reducing cognitive load for people who were likely dealing with trauma and stress around the whole process of family reunification. Some of the specific methods that we used there were to use accordion expanders for legal disclaimers, use links where there was more information where possible instead of putting that all on the site, use shorter chunks of content staged across multiple screens as often as was realistic. And these approaches helped us counter those heavy blocks of text that we eventually received from the government, which had a lot of legalese and requirements. Some people would have legal representation helping them complete these forms, but we knew that many wouldn't. So we aimed to cut redundancy where it was possible, to paraphrase with plain language, provide clarity and confirmation at the appropriate places, and generally just break up that content and use simple headings to guide the user at a high level. Next slide, please. So meanwhile, as all this is being created, the form evolved. The legal nuances kept evolving, which would impact the form logic and then all the translations of the form. So we kept up with this by constantly iterating, but we also started using user testing very quickly so that we could bring those insights to the conversations that we were having with the stakeholders around refining the form. This let us share feedback about how people were interpreting the legalese and the flow of the form, as well as people's impressions overall about whether the site could be trusted and was easy for them to use. Next slide. I will admit that every moment of this project success felt pretty tenuous. On the engineering side, we were having to hard code every single copy change, like every single letter, every single little change across multiple pages, across multiple languages, and across multiple content documents. And every time we thought we'd gotten the final set of changes, there were more. But we were driven by a collective desire to make a positive impact in people's lives, and we had to trust in one another and use really tight governance of our content and our content versioning and our workflows, and keep really frequent check-ins with each other and our stakeholders to make sure that nothing at all was missed and that the ripple effect of each change was made in more than a dozen different places. Next slide, please. So some of the lessons that came out of this that I feel like are, just important to this kind of work where you're wanting to make a difference, but you're doing it one little seemingly feeling tiny step at a time. I think there are some things that become really important across all these different projects. And one is to educate yourself. So balancing audience needs and impact with the legal criteria can be achieved through plain language and headings and in those strategic ways of reducing cognitive load, while you're also kind of helping people understand why those things are important. But it's even more important implementing within immigration reform through design so that you can understand cultural nuances that are going to affect the content decisions that you need to make. So just say to, encourage you to do that education for yourself and understand how those little nuances really do make a difference, and to work closely with translators to check those decisions across all the languages that you're working with. The second lesson for me is to find an advocate or just become one yourself. If you can identify an advocate on the government team who understands the challenges and who will listen to some of the concerns you have, like sometimes they're even seemingly as small as a single word choice, but they're actually can have a lot of importance in terms of how things are understood by other people and what they really mean and what some of the nuances are there. But they can be bigger than that too. And somebody who can speak up when you're not necessarily in the room to do so yourself. So like if the legalese you have in front of you that officially implements a policy that's been enacted, figure out how to advocate for people's real interpretation of that copy by centering their experience. Storytelling helps. Real users who can test the design can help. At times when we didn't have access to users, we worked with the assumption that there was some inherent trauma for every person in our audience, and we advocated for every word choice and every design choice that would recall or exacerbate that experience. And we also leaned on our translators who had, at times, more familiarity with some of the relevant cultural experiences at play and how certain wording might be interpreted. The last one is organization versus speed. Sometimes I find that content design is like not the primary focus, or might be an afterthought, or that everyone wants to provide their own content, or that they can just do it themselves, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right content or even the right sized content for the audience. So I would just say, do what you know needs to be done, kind of like where you're able, while you kind of wait for others to realize that that's useful or is helpful. And I'll say that meticulous organization really saved this project, and just inserting governance from the beginning and ensuring everybody understands it and can follow it. And with that, I will hand it over to C, who's going to talk a little bit more about the translation experience for this work.
Hello, this is Cecilia speaking. I'll tell you about some of the challenges we encountered with translations, and at the end, I will go over some of the lessons we learned. The first is about time and revisions. As the source content took on a more final form, it was good time to hand it over to the translators. But revisions of the English source content kept happening, and kept happening multiple times from multiple directions, sometimes over the same content. So it was a confusing few weeks, especially because we might not miss, in all this hecticness, big things that might be easy to spot, full sentences or big words, but there are smaller, very critical things like an and instead of an or when we're listing requirements for eligibility, or time indicators like from and until. Those things we really, above anything else, we don't want to miss. The solution for that was, instead of having all documents in English on one side and all documents in other languages on the other side, we created one document with side-by-side content, one for English Spanish, one for English and Portuguese. And this way we could see content side by side as it changed, where it would fit. It was helpful for people in our team that didn't necessarily speak Spanish or Portuguese, but needed to handle this content as well. They could have a visual idea of where it's supposed to go. And for translators and the content strategy team, we had a place where we could highlight and leave each other notes and sort of flag last minute changes, so we always had the latest version at any given time. Next slide, please. Stakeholders for this project were set on the use of certain terms, like register. But these terms are naturally panic-inducing. I haven't met an immigrant human being that likes to register with Homeland Security. In addition, some ideas were unclear or were open-ended, left for interpretation. And thankfully, content strategy had the heaviest lift and clarified the vast majority of these instances. But looking at it from the eyes of a translation process surfaced some more ideas that needed additional clarity. Also, choosing those opportunities for extra clear human warmth terms around the scary words that we couldn't avoid was as good a way as we found to lessen the panic. And that speaks to Angela's portion of inserting that whole paragraph of how this site wouldn't share their information and whatnot. Next slide, please. Addressing trauma. This is really about addressing the human beings whose life had been ripped apart. Again, thankfully, content strategy had made the source content clear, crystal clear. But since we don't translate word for word, but idea for idea, we had to find the same kind voice with humanity and respect in Spanish and in Portuguese. For this, we chose to speak in a clear conversational tone. Particularly for Spanish, we avoided the traditional professional sounding Spanish that can be complex. And the aim with that was to reduce that overwhelming feeling that someone might feel going through the site. And we also aligned key terms across languages for consistency. Next slide, please. The real audience. The site would be used by a number of groups of people. There were advocates, legal representatives, parents, children even. But we had the direction to sort of write for everyone without a clear idea of who we were really writing for. So we chose the families, and we centered them around building all of this content and translating it. And from a translator point of view, that made it clear to figure out the way the translation needed to go, and that if it wasn't sounding clear enough for an average family to understand, then it needed more work. And of course, in the end, simplicity and clarity really benefit everyone. Next slide, please. For the lessons, rely on documentation. Those lists of recurring terms, approved terms, and side-by-side documents were really critical for the success of the translation portion of the project. It made the work not only speedy, but most importantly, for consistency. The idea was repeating patterns to help lower the cognitive burden and keep people from trying to figure out what might we be trying to say by just making it really simple and repetitive where it needed to be. The next thing we learned was to focus on the audience. This project moved very quickly, and keeping in mind the audience that we were translating for really helped us keep a clear direction and answered questions at times like, well, what should this really sound like for someone that is on the receiving end of this website? And lastly, become the advocate. I found that wherever you have autonomy to make decisions, do right by those human beings that you're serving. In our case, there was a lot of communication with stakeholders for setting content strategy in English, but we were a little bit more left to our own devices to set the standards for the translation, which was great because the majority of people would speak Spanish or Portuguese or a language that was not English. So we really had some flexibility there to make it sound more clear and really help people out. And with that, I will hand it to Eva.
All right, so this is Eva again speaking. We've heard a lot of stories and examples with some great takeaways. Just to kind of touch back on some of the places that I started in the beginning and kind of pull those threads through. We're certainly lots of examples of human-centered and trauma-informed approach, and really using that as a guide to the work, this HCD plus trauma-informed design. It can really be honored and cultivated through research and how it comes together to impact people's whole experience. But it doesn't come from a single solo member of the team, but rather, a variety of roles where everyone may find themselves advocating. And then, the importance of really remembering to focus on all the pieces that can still help to make the process at least a bit more equitable in the end. We have 15 minutes remaining this afternoon. I would like to open it up for questions. We may have already begun to catalog some of those, from the chat here, but I'm curious to hear of, from others that have been listening in. What kind of, thoughts and reactions and questions do you have?
So I have one question here in the Q&A section of the chat from Danny. It says, thanks for the talk. This person is curious to learn more about how you reconciled regional and national differences in Spanish, for example, Mexico, Guatemala, and Colombia, and curious to know if there are plans to share out some of the lessons learned on preferred terms by different language speakers. So that would be a question for Cecilia.
Hi, this is Cecilia. We had to choose to write in a more global Latin American Spanish in order to be able to speak to as many people from different countries as possible without confusing anyone, ideally. Perhaps realistically, confusing as little as people as possible. So we avoided terms that were region specific. Any kind of slang that might be part of conversational Spanish, of course, was avoided as well. And focused on a more general type of simplicity in terms.
Thanks, C. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if you do have one, feel free to chime in, or even if you just want to kind of chat back and forth or open up another kind of stream of conversation along these lines, we'd be happy to do that as well.
Someone on the chat asked if there is a typical Spanish style guide that you reference, such as plain Spanish.
We use lots and lots of dictionaries and forums for certain keywords, but no particular style guide, no.
We didn't mention it here, but the site also has audio recordings across other languages too, which was like a whole other sort of part of the process, which is a great feature as well, although it's, longer to listen to and, couldn't be developed until all of the content was set. That's one thing that was, I think, really useful for people too, is being able to listen. Another question here. What resources would you recommend for designing for Spanish speakers for those just starting out in this topic?
I'm not sure if that's a question for you or Angela.
If you have thoughts, feel free to jump in.
I think regardless of the place where your particular audience comes from, it's important to immerse yourself in a cultural understanding, whether that's, in this case, a Spanish-speaking audience or an audience from a different country.
For audio recordings, to follow up on that, typically for those, we create a script and then, work with like a community liaison or a translator to translate it, read it, have it recorded, and then have it added to the site backend, do, testing of the audio and making sure that that's high quality. I was less involved once that got handed off, but to my understanding, that was the general process. Kendra has a question. What are some examples of how working from a trauma-informed lens impacted the outcome of this project? For me, this is something that actually really shaped the whole design of the site. We really centered that from the very beginning, and we're able to kind of like pull that through every step of the way to make sure people were included in the appropriate ways, make sure that we considered the impact of certain experiences and words across those. And the outcome, it's certainly being used out in the world today, and I don't have any like specific metrics on that, but from what I understand, it's going well. So we're proud of the work that we did there, and hope that it's having the desired impact to bring people back together.
Hey, this is Sabrina. There's another question from Ryan Hatch. You mentioned organization is critical to managing copy changes, translations, and form updates. Were there any frameworks, tools, and processes that were particularly helpful in keeping the team aligned and informed?
Yeah, so we used Trello to track who was touching which things, and we would have things that were color coded and like kind of multiple layers and filters across those changes that were moving through our Trello boards. So that was one way where we kept really tight clarity around which change had been implemented where and in which language, and did it get coded in, and did it get checked before it got published to the site. So every single one had a lot of checkbox that had to go through. We were supposed to use I think Confluence for uploading documents, but we weren't like ever able to get access to that for some reason. So we had all these workarounds, but I basically used some side-by-side like columns for each of like our content models. And once the English was set, we would do things there, and that was just in Google Docs. So it was pretty basic. The Portuguese had a slightly different approach, and they were using the translator there was using software that could actually track specific translations and determine like if they put something in, if they had already translated it, and if they had not, it would be a new translation. It would flag all the places where it needed to be replaced. So there were a couple of different technologies going on there, but those were the basic ones that we used.
Thank you. This is Sabrina, and I have another question from Jason Wesson. Thank you all so much for sharing this work and for the level of intentionality that was put into being human-driven. Was there any intentional work done to influence the user to switch to their preferred language, as opposed to relying on a translator to navigate them through the English translated websites? Sorry, not websites, pages.
Can you say that part again? Sorry, I was repeating something into it.
It's okay. Was there an intentional work done to influence the user to switch to their preferred language, as opposed to relying on a translator to navigate them through the English translated pages?
Yes, they prioritize that in the site design. So in the header of the site, they can choose from the very beginning, and they can actually move back and forth between languages very easily at the top level. And when you get into any translation of that, you see that same choice option to toggle between languages across the board.
And I have another question asking, did you test these with the native speakers? I assume the translated pages.
Yes, that's the one that I was just responding to. Maybe C could speak to some of that testing, but at least for 2 of the languages that we directly work with, we did.
Yeah, this is Cecilia. We were luckily able to find, in the span of time that we had to work on this project, several people to do usability testing as well as user testing on content in the site itself. Also, some of our teammates in Coforma speak Spanish. So for the Spanish translation, nothing got not reviewed. Once it was done, it was turned over to a different set of eyes that could read it through, enter feedback, and from then it was taken to user testing.
And at the user testing level, the people who were involved there were actual family members who had just gone through that reunification process.
And since there were so many questions about translation, on the IMIVET's website, there was no translation to other languages. The reason for that, from the client's perspective, and we checked this, was that military members are tested for English before they join the military. So the majority of those audience members would have been English speakers, like fairly proficient at that. But yeah, it was not forgotten.
One more question about whether there are written materials we plan to share on lessons learned from this work. We do have a case study, 2 case studies, and then a deeper Medium article that is available for the IPTP work and the together.gov work. In the future, in addition to those more case study level pieces, you'll see some of our process pieces around the design and the research process that may come out, which most of this can be found through the Coforma site, or yeah, I think that's the best place, the Coforma site. And thanks, Danny, you're giving me some great ideas for some content that we could create that would be more useful for folks. Okay. Thanks, Sabrina. Terms are, just kind of pull out that piece of the comment. Terms are, were really like the crux of some of the work that we did here. And some of those were out of our control because they were legal requirements. And, even just shifting to a very simpler word was not going to be acceptable. But we did try to find some ways to soften that, which, hopefully balance like what the meaning of that really was. One of the things that I don't think we mentioned here, but one word that I recall in this experience that we had a little bit of a difficulty translating was the word support, which, so part of the reunification process is people are going to receive support in the US once they're reunified there with their family members. And when I think mentioned like when she was going to translate that into Spanish, support, like some questions came up around like, is it emotional support? Is it like physical support? Is it housing support? Like, what does support mean? And what does that mean for that support to be ongoing? So we were able to kind of expand that word by understanding that it could mean different things for different people, and that the government really needed to provide some clarity around what exactly they were promising to further continue the trust building, and not like, set expectations that were not going to be met down the road. Which really just kind of goes back to that idea that every word mattered.
I guess we're at time. I want to thank everyone so much for listening in today.
Yes, thank you all. I can't see your faces, but it's nice to meet you here.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.